The Philadelphia 76ers have been the biggest winner of the NBA offseason, signing Paul George to a max contract as well as giving Tyrese Maxey the max extension and adding a number of notable players around him. However, it was recently revealed that DeMar DeRozan may have been their backup target if the plan did not come together, and Paul George ultimately did not end up coming to Philly. I'm gonna break down exactly what was said by DeRozan himself, take a look about what this fit would have been, and really acknowledge how much of a step up that Paul George is specifically for what this Sixers team needs. So let's dive fully into things. I'm going to start off with the initial quote from DeMar DeRozan that he was on the podcast P with Paul George. We're getting a good portion of our, news from the offseason to hold us over into the Sixers world. But he was asked about the other teams that he's interested in. And DeMar DeRozan said he chose the Kings over Philly, the Lakers, Clippers, and the Heat. Quote, I just wanted to make sure that the next decision I made gave me the best chance to win, so I'm definitely looking forward to it. And ultimately, we do know that he did sign a 3-year, $73.9 million deal with the Sacramento Kings in essentially a sign and trade between the Kings and ultimately to make the deal happen with the Bulls. But really, that was about the finances making it. He did choose Sacramento. He also very clearly acknowledged that he was waiting on the Paul George decision. And I think this is one of those situations, and there's nothing wrong with this, but with DeMar DeRozan, where it comes down to a bit of the, maybe it comes a little bit more with money. This is the last chance in his career to max out a significant contract. We'll take that in Sacramento, even if you in a front like this is, a win now move. And I'm not going to argue you don't have a better chance to win in Sacramento than Chicago. The bar is pretty much on the floor for that one, but I do think that was ultimately the deciding factor. Now, to talk a little bit about the comparison between DeMar DeRozan and Paul George, I'll start by saying I like DeMar DeRozan. I'm a fan of his game. I have a great deal of respect for him as a basketball player. I frankly think he's a better player than what the overall perception of him is. I think he's a guy that makes really good decisions, can create from others in a way that he does not get the proper recognition, and a lot of other aspects that I just like about his game. But I think it would have been a nightmare fit for this Sixers team. We're talking about that when we're building a team around Joel Embiid, however decision should be made to maximize spacing, and that is the exact opposite of what DeMar DeRozan does. Now, to give a little bit of a head-to-head comparison with Paul George here, you can see a bit of the statistical breakdown that DeMar been around the block a little bit longer, a little bit higher scoring total overall, which did surprise me a bit here, but the real numbers that I do care about, for starters, the Sixers need the rebounding help that they can get. Paul George with the edge at 6.3 per game over the course of his career, 1.7 steals. Paul George, even at this point in his career, I would consider a notably better defender than DeMar DeRozan. DeMar, while he's competitive, a guy that tries, not a guy who ever particularly shined in that category. And really where we should be looking at is the shooting splits here. 3-point percentage in his career, Paul George 38.5%, DeMar DeRozan just 29.6% from beyond the arc here. And to take this a step further, it is the volume that I'm really concerned about. And to give those numbers specifically, in his career, Paul George is a 38.5% three-point shooter on 6.3 three-point attempts per game. To contrast that with DeMar DeRozan, 29.6% three-point shooter over the length of his career at just 1.6 three-point attempts per game. So almost 6 times more that Paul George putting up on a career basis. And to look at just last year in a microscope, that Paul George shot 41.3% from three on 7.9 three-point attempts per game. DeMar DeRozan did shoot his highest volume of career from beyond the arc and still just 2.8 three-point attempts per game, which he connected at only a 33.3% rate. It's never quite made sense to me. Players like DeMar DeRozan who are so keen on getting to their mid-range spots, that is, you understand at this point, the analytics are hammered home in all of our brains about how much more valuable the shot is behind the arc, the extra point that comes with it, for really just a couple steps back, that DeMar is a guy specifically who will shoot pretty deep in that mid-range zone and very clearly seems more comfortable just taking one step in front of the three-point line. I don't quite understand it, and I understand you got to do what the game dictates to an extent, but I do think he's a guy who would have benefited greatly in the overall perception of him if he had embraced modern basketball a little bit more than what's the case. I do think he's a throwback player. And I also think he's kind of a bizarre fit on this Kings team. Again, I like DeMar. We'll be rooting for him, but I'm glad that I'm not talking myself into him in a Sixers uniform at this point in his career. And that does bring us to the point in conversation for Paul George here. And for starters, I did rip off the 3-point numbers. I do want to pull up specifically in comparison to these two here. Taking a look at last year's numbers specifically, that we can see what we had from DeMar DeRozan. 35 years old, 6'6", 24 points per game, 5.3 assists, 4.3 rebounds. That assist number is something that was a little intriguing to me because I do think he could pick up some slack as a playmaker that this Sixers offense still might lack to an extent. But the defensive concerns and the lack of 3-point shooting, just too much to overlook. And there's no doubt in my mind that Paul George is the better option for this team. So very glad that plan A came together. Once again, those 3-point numbers last year, 41.3% from three on 7.9 3-point attempts per game. To put that in perspective, Tyrese Maxey led the Sixers in 3-point attempts per game last year with 8.1. Buddy Hield was the next closest at 6.6. So having a guy like Paul George that is willing to let those deep range shots fly is going to be incredibly important. Not even mentioning the fact that he connects them at an elite rate, over 40% last year, 38.5% from his career. Having that around Joel Embiid is going to be huge for this offense. I really think when figuring out how do you optimize a big man in the year 2024 in the modern basketball atmosphere that we live in, it has to do with as many floor spaces as possible, and that's why I'm very excited about this Sixers team. Think about how defense is going to think twice about doubling down on Joel when it's Paul George and Tyrese Maxey as his primary kick-out options there. That is tough to do. Neither one of those guys are guys you can give open three-point shots to. And by the way, I think Tyrese Maxey taking his game to a whole nother level this year. Now, as far as the big three conversation goes, there's been a lot of talk about the best big three in the NBA. And I recently saw this rankings, not to fully put them on blast, but from Basketball Forever here. And this is the Sixers trio as the third best big three in the league. And I will say right now that sign me up for Paul George, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid to go to war against either of the two in front of them. You cannot convince me that a washed-up Klay Thompson is ready to elevate this Dallas Mavericks team in a way with, sure, I give my props to Luka Doncic. There's no doubt about the talent that he has. But then a guy like Kyrie Irving, do we really think that is a repeatable performance for what he did last year? Again, not doubting his talent by any extent here. We know who Kyrie Irving is as a basketball player. We also know who Kyrie Irving is as a personality. And it feels like the tides have been a little too mild for far too long, that it does feel like you only get so many windows in which you're going to have an unproblematic season with Kyrie. And last year was absolutely one of them. Then the Boston Celtics. I think this is a bit of a different conversation because I still would not consider them a huge trio here. They obviously have other guys, the Derek Whites and Drew Holidays, who are very impact players that might quite make those rankings there. But I do think that if you just want to go body for body and line these guys up, that the trio of Joel Embiid, Paul George, and Tyrese Maxey is straight up better. That Jason Tatum, I think at this point in his career, it's pretty clear that Joel Embiid is the superior talent as far as individual basketball impact. A guy like Tyrese Maxey, I think we might be questioning if if he makes an All-NBA team next year, which I think is very much in the realm of possibility there. We're going to have to change the tune for this completely, and Paul George, I do think, is that missing link in between them. Now, speaking of Tyrese Maxey a little bit here, as I was kind of getting collected for this video here, pulling up the images and everything, there was a quote that popped back from my page that popped up that really warmed my heart about the Maxey outlook for this season. And this also came from the Paul George podcast when Tyrese did his episode, and he was asked about the process of recruiting Paul George, how involved he was, and he was asked his thoughts on Paul George joining the Sixers. Maxey said that Paul George was the guy that Joel Embiid wanted, and that, quote, "I'm a ride with you until the wheels fall off." And I do love that quote from Tyrese, just showing that, like, he's sticking with the big fella. And it is cool that we do have this kind of separation in eras for this Sixers team, that we're still in the Joel Embiid win now window. There's no doubt that this season there's a ton of pressure for this team has to get deeper than just the second round and have some success in a playoff setting for his legacy and to be built around him. But when you do look a little bit down the line, you have this next up-and-coming star, this next generation of Sixers basketball that can be led by Tyrese Maxey as that number one guy, and that is the most stable that we've seen this franchise in decades at this point. So I'm thrilled that this guy is comfortable being that secondary, possibly even third star on the days in which Paul George has going, and cannot wait until the reins are fully handed to him. But shout out to Tyrese Maxey for trusting the process himself with all the financials to make this possible. Shout out to Daryl Morey for nailing the offseason, bringing in Paul George and getting option A so we don't have to talk ourselves into DeMar DeRozan. My spirits would not be nearly as high if that was the overall case here. So shout out to Daryl for getting the job done, and shout out to you guys for tuning in this video here. We're less than a month until at least returning to training camp. Sixers Media Day at the tail end of September, so a lot coming up on the horizon. We're almost through the dead of the offseason. It's going to be here before we know it, so make sure each and every one of you are tapping along right here on Sixers Digest, smashing the subscribe on the channel if you have not already, dropping your comments below, a like on this video, and I'll be talking with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.